Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Psychology and Public Health. To start, I'm going to present Paulo Barbosa, who's presenting Ayahuasca and alcohol dependence. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to present today a survey we conduct in União do Vegetal about the association between, or no association between Ayahuasca use and substance abuse and dependence. This study is a partnership between Universidade Estadual de Santa Cruz, where I come from, Unicamp, University of New Mexico, and it was funded by CNPq, the Conselho Nacional de Desenvolvimento Científico e Tecnológico. Basically, we aim to evaluate, we have two aims. The first one was to evaluate, was to compare substance use between UDV sample and the Brazilian normative sample within the following age ranges. The first one is between 18 to 24 years old. The second is 25 to 34 years old. And the third one, the third age range was over 35 years old. And the second aim was to assess the effect of participation in UDV on substance use and dependence. So basically, this participation was broken up into two variables. The first one is years of affiliation to UDV, and the second one was number of rituals attended during the previous year. We adopted specific criteria for dependence definition. It was the SAMHSA criteria. It was Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration criteria. So it defines dependence as a person having one or more of these symptoms, spend more time than he wish using drug or looking for that drug, a person who uses the substance more frequently than he wishes, a person who develops tolerance to the substance, a person who undergoes physical risk while under the effect of the substance, and personal problems like family problems or law problems related to the use of substance, and also the desire to cease the use. So we use this criteria because the normative sample of Brazil uses this criteria too. So we need to standardize we need to have a standard to compare our results of UDV sample with the results of Brazilian normative sample. We evaluated 1947 volunteers from 10 states across all over Brazil. It was 36 UDV churches, which corresponded roughly to 12% of UDV Brazilian population. Finally, this chart displays the difference between UDV sample and Brazilian normative sample. This is lifetime use of alcohol. You can see that the age range of UDV sample for 18 to 24 years old had a lower use than the Brazilian sample of the same age. UDV had 72.2 72% of lifetime use of alcohol against 78.6% of Brazilian normative sample. The situation is different on the age range from 25 to 34 years old. UDV had greater use of lifetime alcohol. It was 86.6% against 79.5% of Brazilian normative sample. And the age range from over 35 years old, the UDV had a rate of use of 87.7% against 75% of Brazilian normative sample. But this situation is different when you evaluated current alcohol dependence. So the Brazilian incidence of current alcohol dependence is much lower. You can see in the first age range, from 18 to 24 years old, we had 4.9% of dependence among UDV sample against 19.2% of alcohol dependence among the Brazilian normative sample. And the second age range from 25 to 34 years old, the UDV sample had 2.3% of dependence against 14.7% in UDV normative in Brazilian UDV sample. Sorry, and in the age range of over 35 years old, the UDV sample had 1% of the alcohol dependence against 10.4% of Brazilian normative sample. This difference is even more dramatic when we evaluated only UDV people who had more than a year of UDV affiliation, more than a year attending Ayahuasca sessions. So this rate of UDV drops to 35%, and in the age of 18 to 24 years old, and 25 to in the age range of 25 to 34 years old, this percentage drops to 1.4%, and in the age range of over 35 years, this incidence drops to 0.5%. You can check here, just to compare the previous graph, the previous chart. This is the whole UDV sample, and this is the sample of UDV who had more than a year of regular Ayahuasca attendance, ritual attendance. In the lifetime use of tobacco, the results are very similar. You can see in the first age range of 18 to 24 years old, lifetime tobacco use among UDV was 34.9% against 39.5% of Brazilian UDV, Brazilian normative sample. In the next age range, the incidence of lifetime tobacco use among UDV was 52.8% against 40.8% of Brazilian normative sample. And in the age range of over 35 years old, UDV had a prevalence of 61.3% against 52.66% of Brazilian normative sample. The situation also is also very different when we evaluated current tobacco dependence. You can see in all age ranges, the UDV had a much lower incidence of current tobacco dependence. In the age range of 18 to 24, UDV had 2.4% of tobacco dependence against 9.4% of dependence in the Brazilian normative sample. In the second age range, UDV from 25 to 34 years old, UDV had 2.5% of incidence of tobacco dependence against 9.4% of incidence of tobacco dependence in the Brazilian normative sample. And finally, in the people with over 25 years older or more, UDV had 0.9% of tobacco dependence against 12.2% among the Brazilian normative sample. And again, when we evaluated people from UDV with more than 1 year of Ayahuasca attendance, the rate of tobacco dependence also drops dramatically So 0.8 in the age of 18 to 24%, 1.4% among the age range of 25 to 24 years old, and 0.7 among the people who had over 35 years old. Finally, this is a preliminary results, right? It's not unfinished analysis. Anyway, the results are very impressive. We run a logistic regression to evaluate the impact of years of affiliation to UDV on decrease in alcohol dependence. So for each year of affiliation to UDV, there was a drop on about 25.7% on alcohol dependence. And for each ceremony attended during the previous year, there was a drop of 5.4% in the alcohol dependence. The tobacco dependence followed the same, more or less the same pattern. For each year of affiliation to UDV, it was corresponding to a drop of 9.6% in the rate of tobacco dependence in UDV. And for each ceremony attended during the previous year, there was a drop of about 5.3% in the decrease of tobacco dependence. We also run logistic regression to assess the impact of years of affiliation and number of Ayahuasca ceremonies attended during the previous year. So there was also decrease for each year that for each years of affiliation to UDV, there was a drop of 8.4% in alcohol use during the previous year. And for each Ayahuasca ceremony, there was a drop of 6.9% of alcohol use in previous year. Also, tobacco use in the previous year was also impacted by attendance to UDV sessions. So for each year of affiliation to UDV, there was a drop of 8.7% in tobacco use in the previous year. And for each Ayahuasca session attended during the previous year, there was a drop of 5.8% in tobacco use during the previous year. All right. So I repeat, this is a very preliminary result. The results are very impressive, but it's a preliminary. So what we can suggest, we can conclude from this data that Ayahuasca, religious use of Ayahuasca, has a strong protective and therapeutic effects on substance use related problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paulo. Is there some question for Paulo? No? Okay, thank you so much. And next will be Ismail Ali, presenting Mortality, Grief, and the Family, Emotional Healing with Ayahuasca in a Contemporary Context.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Happy Tuesday. Thank you for being here. There's some amazing people speaking today. And I think it's such an honor to be here. I want to start by sharing a little bit of gratitude. I'm really grateful here to be part of the conversation that's happening today. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to engage with some of the biggest questions in the history of human behavior and consciousness, not to mention on a stage with so many incredible thinkers, doers, healers, and so much more. And I would also like to share some gratitude for the presence of indigenous voices and for the honor of being on this land. I've never been here before, and it's such an honor, it's such a blessing. It's really great. My name is Ismail Ali. I come from California, and I'm going to talk about our families. So this presentation will basically just quickly go over these big questions that are stated in the abstract. I'll then briefly describe what this talk is and what I'm intending to do, and then describe some of my own personal experience with the family healing retreat that I participated in. And then I'll close with a few final thoughts. Also, I talk really fast, especially when I'm nervous, and I'm a little bit nervous right now. This is the first time I've presented on this before in public. So if I start talking really quickly, just like do something, and I promise I'll pay attention, and I'll slow down, and I'll make sure to be as clear as possible as I move forward. Yes. So first, some really big questions. This is in the abstract, but I want to repeat them because they're questions that I think are kind of, that are being talked about a lot here this week, and I think are going to be part of the conversation that we continue to have moving forward. First, for those of us who grew up and live outside of indigenous contexts, how do we talk to our family members about ayahuasca? How do we develop multi-generational, culturally relevant healing experiences in those contemporary contexts? And how can combining those experiences with ayahuasca or with other sacred medicines impact our relationship to grief, mortality, and complex family dynamics? As it says up there, the spoiler is that I do not know the answers to these questions, but I do believe that it's worth challenging ourselves to understanding what they are, because they're only going to get more difficult to understand, and I think that this is a fantastic place to have those conversations. Ram Dass is quoted as saying, if you think you're enlightened, go spend a week with your family. That's Ram Dass before and after he spent a week with his family. So this talk is actually about me thinking I was enlightened and then spending a week literally with my family. It's actually a case study using a personal narrative to bridge the gap between personal enlightenment and growth and challenging family experiences. There's often a gap between the knowledge and socio-political, pharmacological knowledge and interest that users of sacred plant medicine like ayahuasca have, and the knowledge and willingness to learn that many of our peers and especially many of our family members may have. In other words, although the medicine may have offered us a tremendous amount of growth and healing, it is often sometimes and often difficult to discuss this work with members of our family for a variety of reasons. In fact, for many people, it is often traumatic or challenging family experiences that lead some of us to ayahuasca in the first place. So we as individuals can do all the work that we want, but family dynamics are often a sticking point for growth. As ayahuasca becomes more prominent in society, which feels inevitable right now, how can we incorporate our personal growth into family growth and vice versa? So I would like to share a story of my experience, in part to respond to the questions posed in the abstract. You'll notice that my talk has very little to do with psychology and I think has some nexus to public health, but it's really using this example as perhaps an inspiration and as a jump-off point for us to bring this work to our families, which I believe is essential to the health of the public. So when I was a teenager, when I was younger, I grew up in California. My parents are both immigrants. My father came from Pakistan, my mother came from Colombia. And I grew up in a fairly interesting, dynamic, multicultural, but semi-conservative environment. And I used to get in a lot of trouble for using drugs. I would experiment a lot when I was younger, and there were a lot of times where I would find myself in situations where, even though I rarely had encounters with law enforcement, my mother, pictured here, would frequently and always catch me. I would always get in a lot of trouble, and I always fought it. I always thought it was so annoying that she would kind of be part of my life in that way. And then, in the mid-2000s, I learned that my mother was diagnosed with cancer. She had had it for some years before, but my father had done a really good job of keeping that from my brothers and I. And over the course of my late teenage years, there became this kind of coalescing of me causing her a tremendous amount of stress with my experimentation, with my use, with the strange paths that I decided to follow, with these strange things that I was interested in, and her, who was a dentist, who studies pharmacology, and who was deathly afraid of people becoming addicted, who was deathly afraid of that outcome, the outcome that's being discussed so much here of like having dependence, of having these problems with these substances, which at the time she could not and did not differentiate. So from the mid-2000s up until 2013, the family dynamic was characterized by years of love and joy and support, but also a tremendous amount of personal suffering on her part, and a tremendous emotional burden on the family until she passed in July of 2013. My mother was more than just someone who told me what to do a lot. She was also a social crux in my family. Her loss led to a vacuum that grief and mourning prevented us from filling. And to this day, we find ourselves challenged because she was really the person that was making us see each other and making us talk to each other and making us communicate and keeping us as unified as possible within the family dynamic. So about a year after my mother's passing, my cousin, who had trained for many years under Taita Kerubin, who's pictured here, and the Cofine tribe in South Colombia, and his mother, my aunt, organized a healing retreat south of Mexico City. The healing wasn't just necessarily from the social and interpersonal impact of my mother's passing. My grandfather was also rapidly nearing death, and my father had found a new partner, and there seemed to be an urgency towards some kind of regeneration that we needed to have. So after a lot of discussion, it was decided that it would be appropriate for us to do medicine in a group context, and that ayahuasca, or in this case Colombian yahe, would be the best vehicle for the kind of broad healing that we were looking for. Ultimately, the group consisted of 3 generations, both of my younger brothers, all of my cousins, 2 of my aunts that were both my mom's sisters, and my grandmother, all who came together to heal. This was in March of 2015. The youngest member was 16 and the oldest was 71. It's important, and I'll come back to this, but more people were invited and either couldn't or chose not to come. And again, I'll come back to that in a second. Because we had a distinct and precise trauma to work with, it was not difficult to convince my family to spend some damn time together. But the focus was not necessarily on the medicine. It was on the healing, with the medicine just being a tool to get there. My cousin especially, who ended up running the ceremony, was very careful to delineate recreational use of a substance and therapeutic use of a medicine, focusing on potentially powerful medicinal benefits that at the time were not particularly known to members of my family. Also, let's be real, as with many people who come to ayahuasca, there was an element of desperation. We felt truly like the family dynamic that we loved was at risk of loss, and that we wanted to renew it. So I learned a few things in the process of bringing these people together. Ayahuasca is a particularly interesting example because it's different from other potentially therapeutic, but at least in the United States, currently illegal medicines, because once someone is fully educated on it, it's unlikely they'll compare it to the use of other drugs, even if they still don't want to take it. So I found discussing, for example, LSD or MDMA, which are both scheduled in the United States and also have potentially therapeutic benefit, tend to have a different conversation than something like ayahuasca does. I also learned that one of the big fears and misgivings that people have about drug use is based on social isolation and antisocial behavior. In contrast, making the experience purposefully inclusive and communal, etc., makes it much less threatening, especially to people who are used to that kind of a stigma association that already exists. When I share this story who are interested but have reservations, personally, I describe especially my grandmother's experience. Sure, it's really cool that I got to sit and drink ayahuasca with my family, but in community healing contexts, I found that it was very important to focus on the most vulnerable of the bunch. So I'll briefly describe what happened in the retreat, and then continue with the closing. So essentially, it was a 7-day-long retreat that opened with a family medicine experience using a saffron extract called Paloma. In between, for 6 days, we did a lot of pretty normal family camp activities. We hiked, we wrote emotional autobiographies, we sat in temescal, we did meditation, we did spontaneous movement exercises. And the goal was to open ourselves up to the most clearly and clean channel of healing that we possibly could. None of us at this point, I think except for maybe, besides my cousin, his mother, had experience. So for all, I think 10 or 11 of us, it was our first experience sitting with the medicine. That 7 days ended with a full family yahe session, which was shamanic in style, moderated by my first cousin. I sat later that year with Taita Kerubin himself in Colombia and found it to be a very similar experience. I noticed it to be much more subtle and much more long-term with what I call undercover emotional benefits as opposed to some other kinds of ayahuasca. We actively included family dynamics in the session. We sang to my mother and to other members of the family who had passed. We catered the ceremony to the goal of strengthening family bonds, specifically with that purpose and intention. With the attendance of so many family members, we called upon our respective lineages from Colombia, Pakistan, India, Lebanon, America, Europe, Africa, to strengthen the essence of the power and to really develop what we wanted to be a conscious and connected healing experience. There was a moment that I realized that we had finally, after so many years, come full circle, where we were using what, at the time, years ago, my mother would have definitely called a drug, which I later learned was psychospiritual medicine, which I later realized was something I had been doing all along to heal our family from the sadness of her loss. Ultimately, this story is about my grandmother. One of the most powerful things that happened that week was I call an exorcism of sadness. It's the closest thing I've ever seen to what people call an exorcism. She was experiencing a tremendous amount of sadness, and the medicine was taking out a tremendous amount of very, very powerful, negative, harmful, shameful energy from her. And there was a moment where she was crying, and we were sitting in a circle around her, all of her grandchildren. And my aunt, her daughter, looked at her and said, "You have a choice. Puede ser la abuelita pequeña, you can be the little grandmother, o puede ser la emperatriz de la familia. You can be the empress that stands in the center of the family." And to this day, my grandmother has embodied the Empress. My grandfather passed away a week after the ceremony. He had already been in hospice. And my grandmother, when she arrived to see him after returning from Mexico 6 days later, found that he had regained lucidity. He had Alzheimer's for 5 or 6 years. And for 20 minutes, he was able to regain lucidity and had conversations with her that they had not had in 20 years. He ended up passing peacefully by her side the moment, like 45 minutes after she walked in, and the comparison of watching her at his funeral and his passing versus my mother's was tremendous. And I still, to this day, give the experience and give the medicine a tremendous amount of credit for essentially what became a completely transformative experience for her. As far as next steps go, inshallah, God willing, that's what we say in Islam, we're planning a family healing retreat in 2017 to deepen the family mandala. One of the primary goals is to get people who chose not to attend last time to be a part of it, including my father. If someone's recording this, Dad, I'm watching you. I'm going to make sure that you come next time. And we hope to deepen the family mandala, not just by reacting to trauma, to having a reactive healing experience, but also to create goals for future collective action and growth. I believe that personal stories, and I've found through this process that personal stories are crucial, and coming out as a user, both to our families and beyond, is a huge part of that. And hopefully, I have a lot more to say at the Third World Ayahuasca Conference in 2 years. I'll end with this last point. I tell this because I believe that radical honesty and personal stories are crucial. Yesterday, someone said to me, people here are talking too much about science and not enough about love. True. Scientific discussion, philosophical research, etc., are not enough. Our families, whether they're related to us by blood or whether we choose them ourselves, will always respond more to love than they will respond to science. I believe that the tremendous potential of this medicine will not be realized if we can't start with the communities that are closest to us. I'm grateful to be part of this community, but I believe that if we bring the knowledge and love that comes with it, beyond these walls and beyond these borders, the impact can be even greater than it already is. Thank you. One quick thing, I'm presenting on Friday. I work for MAPS, and I'll be presenting on MAPS Work with Ayahuasca on Friday. Please feel free to come by if you want a little bit more in depth about the nitty-gritty kind of technical aspects of that. Thank you.
Is there any questions for Ismail? Thank you so much. So next I'm going to present Maurício Diament, who is presenting a review of scientific production on ayahuasca in Brazilian Portuguese.
Google presentation, so just a second. So, good afternoon. My name is Maurício, as said, and I'm a psychiatrist from São Paulo. I'm working with Professor Tófoli, and I'm writing this review, which I also presented in an Open Foundation conference in Amsterdam in last June. So this is a review on the scientific production on ayahuasca in Brazilian Portuguese. And I'm writing this work with the help of Bia Labate too, who did a similar work a few years ago about ayahuascan religions in Brazil. Okay, so I was starting my studies in ayahuasca last year after I got to know ayahuasca. And I've been coming through a lot of works, many of them indexed in PubMed, because it's my field of work, and many of them restricted to Portuguese. To have an idea, last Wednesday, the search for the term ayahuasca in PubMed database returned 190 results, and about 1/3 of them were written by at least one Brazilian researcher. I'm not trying here to be a patriot, of course, but Brazilian scientists have been researching ayahuasca since the 90s, and a lot of this work are not published in international database. So we decided to take a deeper look into this and see what scientists who don't speak Portuguese were probably missing and somehow contribute to the spread of this knowledge. As I said before, I forgot to change the slide. So I search for Brazilian scientific databases and other search engines, always with Portuguese only as a parameter, for theses, dissertations, and journal articles in the fields of psychology, biology, and medical sciences. Those are the databases, Brazilian specific databases I looked into. And the inclusion criteria was simple, not being published in English or translated to English, even if not published, because sometimes you have bilingual dissertations here. Those were excluded. As a result, I found 24 master's and doctoral theses and 11 articles. Biology and medical sciences accounted for 2 doctoral theses and 16 master's dissertations and 8 journal articles. Psychology accounted for the rest of them, 3 of each. Then I divided them into an arbitrary classification that I did on my own. Like, it was easier for me to think about those works in this classification that I made. And the main point of this classification is if they are conducted with animals or with humans. So there are 9 categories, kind of double categories: toxicology with animals, toxicology with humans, chemical dependence models with animals, chemical dependence with humans, physiology and neuroscience with animals, physiology and neuroscience with humans, then mental health models other than chemical dependence with animals, and mental health other than chemical dependence, well-being and psychology with humans, and for last literature reviews. I made this division because for the works I was finding, this was an easy way for me to think about them. So here I present you in colors. I don't know if you can see the colors here or not. You don't have to read all of them, but just to have an idea of the overall distribution of the works. This is it. And this is the rest of them. So, of course, I can talk about all of the works, but I'll show you something that caught my attention, some of them. First of all, is Bruno Gomez, who is here and he's speaking next, who talked about his experience with a group that used ayahuasca in a ritual context. A group who was connected to Santo Daime and with influences from the Peruvian vegetalismo. And they helped people who lived on the streets of São Paulo and abused alcohol and or crack. He analyzed the path of 2 participants of that group and discussed the role of the group leader, the concepts of therapeutic and purity, the evaluation of efficacy in such complex cases, and the way science should approach this traditional body of knowledge that are not always are validated by the so-called natural science criteria. Well, I think he'll explain better than I do. Second, Labigalini, almost 20 years ago, used qualitative interviews with 4 members of União do Vegetal who were alcohol dependents before they entered the religion. He then wrote about subjective effects of ayahuasca and observed an intense possibility of personal transformation and important modifications in their lives and the perception they had about alcohol. Also, the subjects were able to build stronger affective bonds with their families and other members of UDV. On the other hand, the religious experience brought more possibilities of insights about personal characteristics and universal issues that boosted personal transformation, as well as a sensation of contact with the divine. The author observed that their use of ayahuasca did not reproduce the pattern of relief from reality and pleasure-seeking that alcohol had for the subjects. Also, they hadn't transferred the compulsive relationship they had with alcohol to ayahuasca or to the institution UDV. Last year, Oliveira worked with children from Céu do Mapiá, that community situated in Amazonas and considered the capital of one of the branches of Santo Daime. And after excluding intellectual limitation in psychiatric, psychological and neurological treatment in the previous year, she applied the very known projective test of Hoasca, and that showed the children had adequacy to reality conventions with good abstraction, symbolization, and reflection capacities, but those children scored low for self-awareness and interpersonal relationship. What the author says can be due to the way the community is organized, with high levels of collective demands and a strong sense of duty and discipline. In 2014, Alexandre studied social interaction through facial emotional expression recognition with experienced ayahuasca users. He performed the test before and 5 hours after they had taken ayahuasca, and found a significant difference between the before and after intake tests in the accuracy for sadness identification, what can be explained by the described effect of ayahuasca in improving social behavior and promoting optimism. The last work I'm showing you is the doctoral thesis of Mori, who lives in Argentina, in 2005, in psychology, and he explored the traditional therapies of Peruvian Amazon natives to open a space for the discussion of psychoanalytical themes. He discusses material aspects of experiences as an element of subjectivity and the experience of precarity as a possibility to pose questions about the origin of human being and otherness. The author exposes his experience with these therapies and presents 3 case reports of Western patients with drug-related problems that were undergoing shamanic treatment. He took an active role as a facilitator of the interaction between those patients and the native culture. So at the end of the study, he approaches possible contributions of that native traditional therapeutics to psychoanalytic clinic and ethnopsychoanalysis. So I'm about to finish, and as you can see, Brazil has a considerable scientific production on ayahuasca that is not available for those who cannot read in Portuguese. The majority are post-graduation works, and some of them address relevant discussions to the research of ayahuasca therapeutic potentials, and some of them will probably be published in the near future. Sueli, that presented yesterday, her work is also here, but she's going to publish it in English. And also 2 other dissertations will be published as well. Personally, I miss more works approaching ayahuasca and psychoanalysis, something that I hope to explore in future studies. And the whole idea of this work is that maybe an effort to communicate and export more of what have been and is being done in Brazil would be a way to foster more international exchange and stronger multicentric collaboration, and thus enrich global ayahuasca science. Thank you very much. So if anyone has any question. Oh.
Wait for the micro. Please.
Could you tell me the name of this study of the Mapiá children?
It's called The Children Who Dance in the Forest. Children Who Dance in the Forest. Crianças que bailam na floresta. Thank you.
So I'm going to present now Clancy Cavnar, that is presenting an examination of psychological healing with ayahuasca.
can you help me? Whoever, because I can't read Portuguese.
What?
I want regular.
Like this?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Hello, thank you for coming, and thank you for inviting me to the conference. I'm going to talk about the role of identity in psychological healing with ayahuasca. I did my dissertation on how ayahuasca ritual participation affected gay and lesbian people, especially in regard to their identity. That study sought to discover how ayahuasca impacted beliefs often present in religion that any sexual orientation besides heterosexual was in some sense wrong or unnatural. Briefly, my research showed that gay and lesbian people felt affirmation for their orientation as a result of drinking ayahuasca, and none of the 18 respondents said that they felt that there was anything wrong with their sexual orientation. As a student of Buddhism, I have been curious about the notion of identity for some time. Identity can be defined as the qualities and beliefs that comprise an individual, including the sense of self. As considered my research as I considered my research and as I read the literature, I began to see that a change in identity could be a powerful force in healing psychological wounds. The simple shift from victim to victor can make a dramatic change in the outcome. Reading literature on Dzogchen Buddhism, I started to wonder how identity interacts with the ability to be happy, to be more than non-pathological, to have a higher level of appreciation of life than the average person. I should say as a caveat to this presentation that these theories apply to Western minds, famously anxious and filled with existential concerns regarding their identities, and I have no insights into how ayahuasca might affect people outside of this group. A basic effect of ayahuasca on psychological process involves a confrontation with oneself, forcing a greater personal awareness that facilitates a reconstruction or restructuring of the nature of oneself. And that's a quote from Fernandez and Fabregas in 2014. In other words, ayahuasca shows us deeper levels of awareness, and using that knowledge, we can alter our perceptions of ourselves, which can change our identities. The strength of ayahuasca gives it the power to define groups and individuals who use it. Indigenous groups who use it often define their identity by their use of it and is present in their creation myths. Sharing songs and ways of making ayahuasca is another way ayahuasca defines identities for these groups. People who drink ayahuasca in the West define themselves in relationship to the groups whose ayahuasca traditions they follow. An identity that is partly based on lineage or teacher, a style reminiscent of Indian gurus and lineage transmissions. Ayahuasca has the power to shift and divide identities so that, for example, shamans can be in two places at once, sitting before their client while flying through the air or transforming into a jaguar, or a daimista can be singing and dancing while at the same time experiencing a vision of communication with celestial beings in the astral. The metaphor of a journey or trip taken while seated is another way that identities can be seen to be bilocated during an ayahuasca session. The impact of ayahuasca on identity was apparent to me in my dissertation interviews. Several of the participants noted a change in identity, though not of sexual orientation, as one of the curative elements of their experience, whether it was identifying as a nascent shaman, a healer, a child of God, or realizing that their identity was a fabrication built on memories and a false sense of self. Psychotherapy and psychedelics both help redefine identity. Psychotherapy focuses on ego defenses and issues stemming from ego identity. Ayahuasca can loosen the strict boundaries of past identity and allow people to experience other perspectives. The benefits of having a strong identity include stability, confidence, and connection with others who are similar. One of the problems with strong identity can be seen in one of the undesirable side effects that can occur using ayahuasca, that is the inflated ego. In these cases, the identity shift causes the hungry ego to take credit for spiritual gains, using them to feed itself, resulting in a form of narcissism related to ayahuasca in which the sufferers believe themselves to be anointed to relay a religious message or have an important role in relation to others. In this case, the mix of religious sentiment with psychedelics on the ego is not mitigated by the important quality of humility emphasized in most mystical and religious traditions. A strong identity can also box someone in, limiting their options. For example, a strong man who cannot show emotions. Deep-seated role identities are both strength-giving and limiting. Now I want to introduce the ideas of positive psychology. Positive psychology is the science of discovering and applying ideas that make life more fulfilling without being a cure for pathology. Research on the benefits of ayahuasca often reveals results that match the outcomes sought in the field of positive psychology. Qualities that have been reported as effects on ayahuasca, as seen in the literature, include assertiveness, joy of life and liveliness, less signs of anxiety. Drinkers are more optimistic, self-confident, insistent, and emotionally mature, with enhanced mindfulness, personal empowerment, hopefulness, improvements in quality of life, and increased subjective feelings of connection with self, others, spirit, and nature. Increased insight, reframing of cognitive structures, increased imaginary and cathartic emotions, an enhancement of trust and social feelings, and a richer and more joyous life. In regard to a prominent result of ayahuasca use for many, the enhancement of relationships, drinkers reported letting go of negativity, being less cynical, feeling more genuine, feeling more acceptance of themselves, increasing confidence and calmness, feelings of compassion, generosity, humility, recognizing the importance of love, a responsibility to others, an emphasis on simplicity, not harboring bad thoughts about others, and gratitude. A few respondents said that ayahuasca experiences helped them make sense out of their lives. Some felt a new connection to nature. As a result of ayahuasca use, they felt deepening of their relationships and the realization of the importance of interpersonal connections. Ayahuasca provides moral lessons, and this is a quote, "In addition to these beneficial effects, in proper settings, it may also elicit moral lessons with subsequent relief and redemption. This is referred to in Santo Daime as examining the conscience. It can be a painful process, but sometimes necessary for the new identity to be assumed." I'm going to talk about ego dissolution. It's an experience that can occur in the context of a religious experience and also in ayahuasca rituals. When the ego dissolves, it may be frightening, causing a contraction of fear and a resultant panic. But if it is surrendered to it, it can be a sublime mystical experience of union. In the successful experience of ego dissolution, feelings of empathy and compassion may predominate as boundaries between self and other disintegrate. Ego death, or as Jung called it, psychic death, is also called ego loss. It signifies the complete loss of subjective identity. In Jungian theory, this precedes a rebirth into a new identity. The term ego loss was coined by Timothy Leary in regard to LSD experiences. Ego death is the second stage in Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. While ego death in Buddhism is related to understanding one's true nature, which is a permanent awakening from ego fixation. One's true nature, which is a permanent awakening from ego fixation. With psychedelics, and particularly with ayahuasca, the experience of seeing one's true self can be fleeting, and if someone is not prepared for it, horrifying with the participant, if unprepared, panicking and grasping at illusory ideas of self that offer no certainty. And this is from John Harrison. In the book History of LSD Therapy, Stanislav Grof describes ego death in the context of psychedelic use. The main objective of psychedelic therapy is to create optimal conditions for the subject to experience the ego death and the subsequent transcendence into the so-called psychedelic peak experience. It is an ecstatic state characterized by the loss of boundaries between the subject and the objective world, with ensuing feelings of unity with other people, nature, the entire universe, and God. For psychedelic experiences, the positive correlation between ego dissolution and increase in well-being was stronger than between ego inflation and change in well-being. So people who took ayahuasca or took psychedelics felt increased good feelings from ego loss. Fighting the experience Fighting the experience of ego threat in an ayahuasca session makes it harder to endure. Surrendering helps the difficulties pass. Relaxation is the opposite of contraction. This relaxation, combined with the diminished power of the ego, gives room for identities to change. Shifts in the bedrock of identity become possible with expanded consciousness combined with the relaxation of the surrender. The positive changes made to non-pathological ayahuasca drinkers and to those with addictions and other problems as well are due to ayahuasca's ability to directly address the ego and blast through its defenses to permeate the core identity. When shift happens there, the ego is transformed or minimized, and the good qualities of humankind, recognized in compassion and humility, are able to shine forth. The capacity to be happy and feel gratitude for life increases, with deeper insight into identity, leading to greater feelings of connection and mystical insight. That's that.
Is there some question for Clancy? Oh, yeah.
You talk about ayahuasca use, but I think one should think about ayahuasca use in certain contexts. I mean, to generalize, all different kinds of uses. Don't you think that's dangerous? Or what do you think about that? And another question. I've been a member of Santo Daime of Sefluris for many years, and I've seen many gay people who, in fact, in the Sefluris, there isn't any sort of open kind of prejudice. But people tend to become asexual and don't talk about being gay or lesbian very much. People might even know that they're gay, but it becomes something that isn't important, but then it no longer is part of their life either.
So I guess my conclusions are all based on ritual use of ayahuasca and not home experimentation or whatever. And as far as the gay thing goes, I think that there is a lot of the playing down of sexual orientation in Brazil and countries in South America, but in North America it's pretty different. And I'm also a member of Sefluris, and I'm gay, and I'm in Santo Daime in California, and I don't get any feelings of that I need to keep it quiet or pretend to be something that I'm not. So I think that's more like related to the country and the culture that's there. And I think as we see things are changing slowly, but eventually I think that everyone will be cool. Shout. You can come here.
Thank you. So actually this is more like an anecdotal remark that I would like you to comment on, which is that recently I was talking to a gay person, and when I told this person, well, in the north of Brazil, in Acre and in Santo Daime and some other churches, you have a separation of the sexes. You have women on one side, men on the other. And then this person said to me, oh, this is no problem for me and my partner.
Any more questions? Okay, so now we're going to see Bruno Ramos presenting the use of ayahuasca in a ritual context on the recovery of homeless people.
Hello. Hello, everybody. My name is Bruno. I'm a psychologist. I'm from São Paulo, Brazil. And what I'm going to present, it's my research on my master's degree on public health. It's an ethnography. Just a second, I'll put my presentation. Well, first of all, I'm just a little bit bizarre to be speaking in English here in Brazil, but since we got an international audience, I think it's good to speak in English so people can see what's happening here in our country. And since I have a book, I'm selling a book about this experience too in Portuguese, so whoever doesn't really understand everything in English can talk to me and read the book and etc. So I'm gonna present this experience that I followed for a few years. I've been working with homeless people since 2004 in a region in São Paulo called Cracolândia, with a lot of crack users, a lot of life and everything else too. And in 2005, I got to know a few people that were doing ayahuasca rituals to recovery homeless people. And when I heard about this, I thought, oh, I guess those people, they must be very serious or must be very crazy, huh? And they were really both of them. And it was a very serious, very good work that they were doing. And I got really involved in this. And around 2009 to 2011, I did this research to try to understand how this recovery was happening and what was the whole of the ayahuasca, right? Because here in Brazil, we have this legislation about ayahuasca. Since we have all our religions on ayahuasca, we have this legislation that allows the religious use of ayahuasca, but doesn't allow the therapeutic use of ayahuasca. It's a little bit strange because even in the religions, in two of them mainly, there is like all this discourse about cure and therapy and getting better and all that ayahuasca can do for you. But there's this conflict, you know, and so I started to study this to try to understand what is this therapeutic use, what we are talking about when we talk about cure, and how does that happen exactly? Because I see a lot of studies about the therapeutic use of ayahuasca for depression, for anxiety, for drug dependence, and etc. But it goes really quickly to a very biomedical logic. It starts to works almost as a medicine, like a pill or things like this. And when I got in touch with this group, I noticed really fast that it was much more complex than this, and it worked in a very different way, right? And so I did this research. It's an ethnography. I went to the field and had ayahuasca with them many times and followed the lives of those people that were recovering through this work to try to understand how these cures they were happening and what was the whole of the ayahuasca, the sessions, the other practices, mestizo and indigenous practice that they were using, and what did they understand as a cure, as a recovery? Because they were working with homeless people have no home, of course. They were using a lot of drugs and a lot of problems on their lives, right? And when we think about ayahuasca, it seems like almost like something magical, right? Oh, people drink ayahuasca and they get better, everything changes. And I started to study this group to try to understand how this was happening. So this group, the name of it was Unidade de Resgate Flor das Águas, like a rescue unit, Flor das Águas. Flor das Águas, like a hymn from Mestre Ineu, one of the last hymns that he received. But it was also the name of that place. That it was like the first church, the first Santo Daime church in São Paulo region. And from that, after that one, other churches opened and it started to work. And so those persons that started this work, they were from Santo Daime too, but they were already also working with homeless people in São Paulo downtown. It's very interesting because when the church closed, they started to use the same space to work with homeless people, and so they had all this symbolic meaning of things that were left behind and things that people were not using anymore, and people that were not being part of society anymore. So, and they started to invite the people from the streets with whom they were working. And at first it was rituals in a very Santo Daime format, like it was with the chants from Santo Daime, with the farda, with the clothes, and etc. And little by little, with many problems, they started to change the kind of ritual that they were doing to integrate with other practices. They started to have this exchange of knowledge with people from Peru, from Ecuador, from Mexico, to try to, so the people from this group started to go to those other countries and have diets and try to learn about the purges and the other practices that come from this mestizo way of understanding healing. And they started to incorporate those practices, and also they started to receive curandeiros on the works for homeless people to try to incorporate those practices. In the beginning, so they started to do this Santo Daime ritual, and there were a lot of problems, like the homeless people started to screaming. They stood screaming for like 4 hours, the entire ritual. People started to run away in the middle of the forest, and people had to go after them. And so we had many problems in the beginning. So that's why they started to integrate the other practices. So the idea was to cleanse more people before entering with the light from ayahuasca. So in the moment of the ritual, they would be more clean and would profit more, get more from the ayahuasca experience. And so they started to have these dietas, the diets isolated in the forest, to cleanse, and the purges with plants from the Amazon and plants also from Brazil, to clean the intestines, to clean the stomach, to clean the entire body. Also, they started to, and how did they present ayahuasca to people from the streets? They invited people to go to do a trekking, to go walking to the forest, to this place, and in the beginning they didn't offer ayahuasca in the streets, right? It's not like the best setting. So they invited people to go, let's spend the weekend in the forest, in the woods, and relax a little bit. And over there, people started to talk and get more close to each other. And after that, the homeless people start to hear about, Daime, ayahuasca, what's that? And so a few of them started to participate on the rituals. And also the curandeiro, the main healer from the group, he also developed many other techniques to take care of people in an individualized way. So he could notice some things that people needed and etc. And so he proposed a few things to other people, things that would have a very weird logic sometimes, things that you could understand, but usually that would bond the guy the homeless people with them in a very strong way. And we had, it's very interesting to think how was this happening, because you know, for us, like intellectualized people, people that have heard about ayahuasca and etc., it's one thing. But to give ayahuasca to people who are on the streets, have never heard about it, sometimes we had many weird situations. Like we had in a moment a curandero came from Peru, and he was like you know, cleaning people with Palo Santo and Agua de Florida, and people from the one of the guy who was living on the streets, and he saw this wood burning, and he thought, oh, they're gonna put fire on me, they're gonna burn me all over, and so he started to run away from the curandero. So we had many conflicts of understanding what was happening, right? So, and this was, I guess, also the main tools that the people were using to use ayahuasca and also the other techniques in a symbolic way to help people to think about their lives and to implicate themselves on their lives. So I followed a few guys. In my book, I present in a deep way the story of two of those guys. They are very well today. They're not on the streets anymore, and they're not like using drugs on a regular basis anymore. And so one of the characteristics that I saw in this process is that ayahuasca was not, it was like a main thing that was occupying this process, but it would be nothing, ayahuasca would be nothing, it wouldn't make such a big difference if it wouldn't be like inside this strong relationship with the curandero. So I think the ayahuasca was a tool that the curandero was using, but this relationship with him was the strongest part of the cure process. People were living on the streets. They didn't have many strong bonds with other people. You know, you're living on the streets. No one cares about you. Everyone's treating you badly, etc. And so this relationship with the curandero was very important. And so and one thing that shows this very well is that when the curandero died, two of those guys, they stayed like to live the grief and to suffer. They stayed a few weeks on the streets again. Like since the guy died, they went again to the streets, and after that they gained up their forces and they went out of the streets again. And also inside this relationship with the curandero, Daim was seen not as a substance like as a DMT or something that acts on you. It's something was lived and perceived by the homeless people as a divine being and a teacher, not like just on the discourse. Also, the experiences that people were having with ayahuasca and the effects that ayahuasca was causing on them had many strong symbolic meaning. And people, so when you suffer, ayahuasca was telling them that you shouldn't smoke crack that much. When you're feeling okay, it showed to them that they were doing okay and they should go on doing what they were doing on their lives. And so this presence of the suffering and the good moments with ayahuasca, they were like communications from the daime, from the tea. So that's a very important thing that people were living with this experience. The experience show a part of ayahuasca, it's the main part for them. And because people were having ayahuasca and going to the streets again. So imagine you have like a wonderful experience, so you see that everything can change, and then you're on the streets again. And you start smoking crack again, and then you start to do everything that you were doing again. So people were like going back and forward, trying to reorganize themselves and suffering again. And this Daim kept on saying to them, oh, you must not stay on the streets. You have to sleep somewhere else. On the streets you will never be okay again. And so all those tips, those hints that I was kept on saying to them through their suffering, through their experience, made them start to dream about new ways of being on life. Not being on the streets anymore, being another person. Two of the guys that I followed, they started to want to be curandeiros also. They were on the streets and they thought, oh, if I organize myself, if I take care of myself in a better way, I can help the healer, I can help the curandeiro, and I can be a better person. And so they started to dream in another ideal way of being. And before that, they were like living on the streets and had like no hope, no perspectives. And so when they started to dream about themselves again, they started to take care of themselves again. Because before that, they wouldn't mind about sleeping like besides their own shit, and smoke crack and don't eat and etc. And so after that, with all those rituals, one following another, and all those cleansings, the people, they started to organize themselves in another way, to find a place to sleep, to don't smoke that much crack, don't drink that much alcohol, and also to remain clean, because they noticed that when they were clean, they would get more stronger to face the challenges of the world. So ayahuasca had this importance as an otherness, another subjective entity that communicated with them and showed them that they could be stronger and cleaner and in a better way. So with that, they started to, little by little, organize their lives and find a place to sleep and don't smoke that much crack and etc. And when that's not like when you're living on the streets, you have a very unstable life, right? You try to organize yourself and you find a place to sleep, then you're expelled from where you are, people don't want you there anymore, and then you get arrested, and then etc. And it's always something happening on your life. And so with all those hints from the ayahuasca and the support from this relationship with the curandeiro, they could keep on going, because before that they tried to organize themselves and then, oh, that I will never be good again. I was made to live on the streets. There's nothing that I can do. But with all this support from the daime and from the curandeiro, they kept on trying, and that was the most important part, to keep on trying or be in a better way. So just to a conclusion, it's a very different way of using a substance to heal than like a medicine pill. It's completely different because it's inserted in this strong relationship and all those symbolic experiences. They are the most important part of the experience. And also I could notice that it was very different from a religious conversion, at least in this group that I studied, because since they were working with homeless people, they weren't proposing a very strict moral way of living. They were just being like receptive and receiving people. And so each one of the persons that I followed, they had very different ways of idealizing themselves. One of them didn't want to have sex anymore, the other one wanted to be a curandeiro, the other one kept on using marijuana, the other ones didn't want to use drugs anymore. So there wasn't like a strict proposal of a way of living, when each one, ayahuasca made each one dream about a different ideal of life. And so each one kept on looking for, and they started to find a better way of living, and many of them are very well now. Now this work is not like working anymore, because the main healer died in 2013, but we still support the people that are still connected, because since, you know, they are still close to us, you know, and since they are they have this homeless history. It's very hard to face stigma and to be included in the society in another way. So they get very close to us, and then we still support them, and we still have ayahuasca rituals with them, and etc. And well, it's very fast and very short, but I think that's it.
Thank you, Bruno. Is there some question for Bruno at the end of it? Let's come down here.
Bruno, thanks for your presentation. Very briefly, I'd like to know which insights you can gather from your experience thinking about the future therapeutic use of ayahuasca in general, not only for homeless people, but from that experience, what you can imagine that you learned from that for a possible future use.
So I don't know if it's just because I'm a psychologist, but it seems to me that it's inserted it's almost like in a psychotherapist process, because the experience has a very important role, but it's inserted inside of a relationship, and this relationship is very important. If it could be with a healer, with a taita, with like the padrinho from your church or the master from UDV or etc. There's like this relationship that happens, and it seems to be important, So I guess that the experience with the substance can be meaningful. That's why I think that's important, because sometimes people have a very strong experience, but that's not meaningful for him to have an important impact on his life. It's like, oh, I have seen very interesting things. It was incredible, but how this can have an impact on your life? And it seems to me that when it's connected with this kind of relationship, it helps a lot to have a meaningful experience. Yeah.
Hi, Bruno. Even people that use drugs or alcohol for years and then stop it because of ayahuasca or other ways, they sometimes go back to the drugs or alcohol. In this case, do you have some data about how many % of these people goes back to the street and leave the treatment, just go out? And compared to the other ways like conversion, religious conversion, or other treatments to resocialize these people, it's more or less, how does it work?
So I don't have like data like this, statistical data and etc., because I made this ethnographic and qualitative research. So I don't have like those kind of numbers, but usually I notice that it's the same when you are fat and you have a diet and you get thinner, and then you stop doing your diet and you get fat again. So if you stop taking care of the situation, things will get worse, So I noticed that when people have the support, they keep on having the support, they can remain well for longer. But sometimes when people they go like in a therapeutic community, for example, and they get well, they get really prepared for life and etc. And when they go out to the streets and they don't have ways to hold on that good feeling, it's easy to go back to the other situation, the other lifestyle, for example. I don't know if we can compare. That's a good study to do, to compare different ways of taking care of people, different ways of treatment. But I think the best way of the best treatment is the one that works for you. So each person can find one kind of treatment. If you're like a evangelical person, maybe you will be happy in an evangelical therapeutic community. If you're from Umbanda, where the evangelical don't like Umbanda, for example, will suffer a lot in this kind of therapeutic community. So it really depends on which kind of person you are, which kind of treatment is being offered to you, and etc.
My question is, sorry. Did you do any screening? Because we have a lot of homeless people in San Francisco, and I have fantasized about what if they took ayahuasca, but their mental conditions would rule them out of attending any ceremonies that I know of. And my other part of my question is, were there any people that you considered a failure of that treatment?
I was just during this process. I was just like following and helping. I wasn't the main, like the healer, you know. So, but there was psychotic people having ayahuasca, and so I got really surprised with this kind of situation, for example. But I noticed there was this previous support. You know, people didn't. It wasn't like going on the streets, taking people inside your car and giving them ayahuasca. They stayed like 2 days, like in the middle of the forest, eating well before having ayahuasca, and this intimate relationship with the people helped a lot to reduce the problems that people could have during the experience, and also I guess those purges and those diets helped a lot also to prepare people for the experience with ayahuasca. I saw like 2 guys that were psychotic and didn't have ayahuasca, for example, because they were, when the healers, they noticed that they were like not very well organized. They didn't have ayahuasca, but they could participate on the other parts with the dietas and the purges and etc. And even without ayahuasca, they would get better because they were close to people.
And this will be our last question. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Bruno, would you agree that the cure could be summed up with the denomination recovery of self-esteem?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good idea. Sure. Yeah. Because I guess people that have abandoned themselves because they didn't love themselves anymore. And so when they noticed that the others were caring about them, they started to care about themselves again. Yeah.